Thank you everybody for coming. My name is David Sigerson and it is not Konstantin Greger who I was originally planned to do the presentation with. Anybody here looking for some kind of tall, dark, Germanic kind of guy, you're going to be a bit disappointed if that's the only reason you've turned up. Oh. So, who am I and how can I kick off your Tableau conference to a good start? I've been a solutions consultant with Tableau for about 2.5 years. I used to have a beard, maybe not anymore, but that will actually be relevant later on. I was chosen to present this topic to you today, which, you know, I think that's an interesting challenge. You know, why was I asked? When a boss comes to you and says, I'd like you to present on how to lie with statistics, you've got to be thinking one or two things, right? Either you're good with statistics or you're just really good at lying, right? And I wasn't quite sure which one he was really aiming for, but, you know, I'll let you be the judge. I've actually got a history in sort of analytics. I've been around the space for about 20 years. And actually, I've also got a deep interest in psychology, AI, cognitive science, all that kind of stuff. And I'm hoping that's why I got picked. But an even more interesting question is, who are you? I've actually got more people here than I expected. I thought it'd be a sort of relatively low-key session. Because who comes to a presentation wanting to know how to lie with statistics, right? What's wrong with you? Is it that you think that, you know, by learning how to lie better, you'll be better in your jobs? I don't know. It's, I expect you're probably a bit like me. You're into your analytics. You probably figured it would be a good opportunity to do something maybe a bit different that's not directly product oriented, you know, not level of detail calculations or server administration, and just, you know, you're interested in this kind of area. So hopefully it'll be good for you. The talk was originally developed and designed and planned by a couple of Americans, and they based it on this book, which is called How to Lie with Statistics, hence the title. Now, apparently this is a book that's commonly used in grad school or high school in the US, so it's kind of well known over there, but in the UK, I hadn't heard of it before. Also, this book is like 50, 60 years old. And whilst it's extremely relevant, all the examples that they pull out of it is, you know, American politics from the 1930s or something like that. So I've updated it with a few more modern books. A couple of these very good books, which I thoroughly recommend. The Field Guide to Lies and Statistics is more or less the same thing as the original book, but it's just a bit more up to date. And then we're also going to touch on the more sort of psychology side of it, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And he was, or is, a behavioural economist that has lots of information that's relevant to the stuff that we're covering today. So what's the key takeaway? You could potentially take away a lot of things from this session, but most of all I just want you to understand how statistics can affect our decision making in everyday life and how it's important that we engage with the numbers around us. We don't just let them feed into our mind, we actually engage with what we see. We don't just repeat and repeat and repeat the numbers that we hear down the pub to, you know, in the next meeting that we have. So just to start the session, I wanted to talk about professions. There is a survey that was done by, I think, Ipsos Mori. What are the most and least trusted professions? Who do you expect to tell the truth? So the fact is that there are some professions that are more trusted than others. We're more likely to believe what they say. So based on the UK data, the bottom of these professions were politicians, government ministers, weirdly enough footballers. I'm not quite sure why they've got this reputation of lying or, you know, being mistruthful, but yeah, there you go. Diving, yes, good. I like that. That's a good suggestion. So who else? Well, actually in the middle, we've got ordinary people. If you walk up to somebody in the middle of the street, we tend to be relatively trusting. You know, we're over 50%. We tend to believe them more than we wouldn't believe them. But it's weird how if they just admitted that they were a lawyer, we'd suddenly be questioning who, you know, what they tell us in the future. But the winners, if I can just click on my slides, yeah, finally at the top we have doctors and nurses. So teachers, professors, scientists. And I'm not quite sure what these professions have done to earn our trust. You know, is it because they've got academic qualifications? Is it because we need to trust them because when we encounter them, our lives are kind of in their hands? Is it that they're more likely to use statistics? Maybe they are or maybe they aren't. But the important point is we trust these professions in their domains. We trust them to be competent and relevant and reliable. But we've got to understand that their expertise is always constrained within a particular area. So just because we trust a doctor doesn't necessarily we trust them to drive us to school. They might not be a good driver, right? But the fact is that whenever somebody looks sort of vaguely academic or related to healthcare, we tend to trust them a little further. So just in case the presentation doesn't work very well, I'll put on my doctor's coat. So hopefully this will help me today, but again, just remember that doctors don't always make the best statisticians. So moving on the agenda, just going to skip through, well, we're going to go through all these sessions. We're going to ask, is there a problem actually out there that we need to address? Then talk about, this is kind of a spoiler, then talk about how and why there is a problem. We'll break it down into the visualization, psychology, calculations, etc., and hopefully wrap up with some good stuff for you. So we'll start at the top. Is there a problem that we have to deal with? Is there a problem with lying with statistics? So what are the kind of things that I'm actually talking about? It's this kind of thing. Voted #1 presentation. It's a statement. 80% of people would watch again. 4 or 5 women would recommend to a friend. These are statements that can be made, but they're not necessarily grounded in any kind of truth. You've got no reference. You don't know who's actually said them. I'll say that they're all true, but I won't necessarily how or why they've come about. What I'm not actually talking about is bad presentations or bad visualizations. So for instance, we could look at this chart, whatever it might represent, and say, well, it's badly represented, but it's not necessarily a lie. It's just whoever did it is a bit incompetent. They've chosen a really bad way of displaying that particular data. Now, what I want to focus on are really the statistics that sort of guide us and lead us to a certain conclusion, but misrepresent the data that's underneath it. And those tend to be a lot more subtle than something as broad as this. Okay, not always that subtle, but I assume everybody knows what this is. We've probably got a mixed audience here. This was the bus that was used in the Brexit campaign, that people said that, by coming out of Europe, we'd get a lot more money and we had to spend it on NHS. So for those of you not from the UK, the NHS is our National Health Service. So great, let's come out to Europe, let's spend more money. Yeah, everybody's a winner. We still talk, for those of you not based in the UK, we still talk about this a lot. Okay, it's you've moved on with your lives, but we're still sort of talking about Brexit. It's all the time. But the weird thing is, the figure is out there. It's been out there in the campaign. It's still out there a year or however many months later. And even though it's been discredited by some significant people in politics, in industry, even people from the what's it called, the Statistics Authority, they've come out and said that figure was nonsense. Okay, it was misleading. But it doesn't matter because the case has been made. And the average person isn't getting into the argument about whether it was right or wrong. They just know it was out there. It's helped them form an opinion. So we've got to watch for these kind of things, right? Because as soon as the statement or the statistic is made or made public, often we can't sort of step back from it. Often the statistic is something we just don't notice, or the lie is something we just don't notice. And I'm going to come back to this later on, but this is an example where a story, not even a story, a scientific study was performed to prove that there was a connection between losing weight and eating chocolate. Now, who doesn't like chocolate, right? And who doesn't love the idea of actually being able to lose weight whilst eating chocolate? It's almost like, it's a godsend. It's a dream come true. I know I certainly like chocolate. But, classic cliche of our time, it is fake news. This was actually a sting or a setup by a scientist and journalist to actually prove how easy it is to get stories out there and how quickly media are to pick things up. And we will come back to this later on. So let's just get into it. How do we actually lie with statistics? Maybe I've got you already thinking about some of the news stories that you've read this week, maybe which ones are fake, which ones aren't fake. But hopefully now we'll get into some of the tricks of the trade that people use to actually try and mislead or guide you. Now, some of you might have seen this slide before. Tableau uses visual analytics to take advantage that our visual systems happen long before cognition, long before sort of conscious decisions. We're able to spot patterns, outliers, things that are different immediately, and we do it in an unconscious manner. Now, in some ways, that's absolutely fantastic, right? It means that we can find these outliers, we can find these issues that might be within our data or our business or whatever. But what I hope you can see is that if you begin to misuse this unconscious ability that we have, you'll start to read things into situations that aren't necessarily there. So first example, typical kind of marketing. We've got a 3D pie chart. Now in Tableau we tend to moan about pie charts and their use, and we don't necessarily encourage them, but actually I don't care about whether it's a pie chart or not in this particular case. What I really want you to focus on is that it's been put into 3 dimensions, okay? It's been given depth, which has nothing to do with the analysis that's actually being performed. What it's telling you is for this particular car, this Werner, that's obviously a US-based car, it's the number 1 in a particular segment. It's trying to tell you how great it is. Look at it, front and center, bright yellow, shiny, fantastic. But look at all the things behind it, the sort of darker colours, the things that you can't quite see. They're actually being hidden by the 3D chart, i.e. the added dimension is confusing or messing around with the message that the data actually portrays. And there's no doubt that the Werner is the best car in that particular segment. But when you put it into a pie chart, it's just not as impressive, right? It doesn't make you think, buy me, buy me, buy me. You know, it's the car that I must buy. There's actually some other cars in there that are particularly relevant, okay? So that's a pie chart. Now getting on to our friends, the politicians, talking about bar charts. This is an example from, I think, over 10 years ago, the Sun newspaper. For those of you who don't know or aren't in the UK, the Sun newspaper is definitely not very Labour-oriented. What we have is a bar chart that says, hey, look, the Lib Dems have suddenly got, you know, they've overtaken the Labour candidates. There's 4% difference between the Lib Dems and the Conservatives. The Lib Dems and the Labours in a poll. There's 10% between the Lib Dems and the Conservatives, but do they present that? No, because what they're trying to say is, hey, everybody get on the Liberal Democrat bus in order to, you know, fight against the Conservatives. And when I was looking around, there are actually dozens and dozens of these kind of bar charts that are used in flyers and newspapers and stuff, and very much related to politics. I don't want to get into politics, but here's just another example. A Lib Democrat candidate. Oh, what a mixture of words. A Liberal Democrat candidate, Sir Alan Beath. I could give him the benefit of the doubt. He's chosen to say that actually Labour is 18%, maybe squash that down just to try and get the copy in on the left-hand side. But let's face it, what all I learn about Sir Alan Beath here is that he didn't do very well in maths class, or, you know, he's actually trying to be misleading in some kind of way. I'm not quite sure what he's trying to say. Is he trying to say that actually, you know, you might have been a Labour voter who's moved to the Lib Democrats, don't go back to them. Don't go back voting for Labour because it's only the Lib Dems and the Conservatives are really fighting for this. I don't know. I don't really mind, to be honest. But it's not just politics, okay? Anybody know who this guy is? Probably do. This is Tim Cook, so he's the CEO of Apple. So we're talking about a very sort of commercial organisation. And he presented this particular curve at one of his big Apple conferences. And look at it. It's a beautiful curve. It's smooth, it's swooshing, it's going from the bottom left to the top right. You know, it's everything that you want from a business curve. And some of you have probably spotted it already. It's not just about iPad sales, it's about cumulative iPad sales. And all of us, or most of us who are perhaps familiar with this kind of thing, all cumulative curves do that, right? They're always going to increase over time. But if you're going to choose to present a sales message, well, why not do that one? Because when you start to look at the real data, if we look at it in Tableau, well, first of all, it doesn't swoosh quite as well. Okay, so this is the same chart, cumulative sales. It's a bit jaggedy, so I can see that they've done some kind of fine-tuning there. And I've not added the colours as well, so it doesn't guide your eye away from that aggressive start of iPad sales at the beginning. If we take the message away from the cumulative sales and actually see what's going on, well, sales aren't so good, right? Well, they're not bad, but they're a bit seasonal. It's sometimes selling more, sometimes selling less. Certainly got a lot of sales at the beginning, but now, not so much. If we try and add the smoothness, if we try and be a bit kind of cool for Tim, we get this kind of curve. We add a moving average to it. And actually the picture then doesn't look that positive at all. We see quite an aggressive growth to begin with. Everybody's buying the iPad. It's the device to have. And then over time, it's flatlined. It's potentially even dropped off. But he doesn't say that at the conference, right? What he presents is the lovely, swooshing, beautiful blue curve. So what's the point of this? The point is that the picture always wins, okay? The unconscious brain is going to interpret the picture first and then impose a message upon it. So if you get the picture right, you stand a good chance of actually controlling the message and the way that we interpret it. So let's dive into that a little bit more. Let's talk about the psychology of decision making and figure and interpretations within the brain. Let's talk about this wonderful brain. Now, Kahneman, one of the behavioural economists, So throughout human history, there's always been a split or an understanding of a split between unconscious and conscious desires. You know, mythology, historical stories, Freud and Jung, you know, Skinner, and even the modern day behavioural economists like Kahneman, they've kind of acknowledged that there's kind of two systems of work. And what the behavioural economists of the 1970s actually did was a series of ingenious experiments that showed that actually this unconscious world that we think is just kind of behind the scenes and not doing much, it's actually controlling us most of the time. It's actually making most of the decisions for us. And they coined the two systems as System 1 and System 2. System 1 is actually kind of our caveman brain. It's the brain that the part of the brain, the inner chimp that we have, it's the thing that we've been using the majority of the time for the past 100,000 years. It's not stupid. It's actually extremely smart. It's extremely effective. But it's the part of the brain that makes extremely quick decisions. Okay? It's the part of the brain that's going to stop you from getting eaten by a tiger. Right? It has to make those decisions really quickly, regardless of the information. It can't sit there and analyse information. It has to go with what it's got. Compared with that is the more what we typically call like the conscious side, the System 2 side, which is much more slow thinking. It's much more logical thinking. It's the kind of thinking that actually you can only do in a kind of calm and measured way. Because if you're not calm and measured, System 1 tends to take over. There's stresses, there's issues that you're not necessarily thinking about. And what they found, these two scientists in the 70s, and it's been repeated ever since then, is that System 1 is largely in control. It's largely influencing how we interpret the world all the time. Let's just put these two systems to a test very quickly. This is one for you guys. This is a classic example. This is like from psychology tests sort of in the 1960s. I'm going to read out two statements about Linda. And I want you to make a snap judgment, and then I'll ask you how you vote on this. I want you to quickly decide which is more likely. So Linda's 31 years old. She's single, outspoken, very bright. She's got a degree in philosophy. She was a student, and she was deeply concerned with the issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in several Me Too demonstrations. So which is more likely? Is Linda more likely a bank teller, or is she more likely a bank teller who is active in the feminist movement? Okay, I'll give you a couple of seconds. Right now, hands in the air. Who thinks it's number one? Who thinks number one is more likely? Okay, got a good mix. Who thinks number two is more likely? Okay, good. Got a mix. I think most people have gone for number two. Number one is actually more likely. Okay? Number one is she a bank teller? Of the two attributes, the second statement is actually, it's a conjunction. It is, it's that she's a bank teller and belongs to the feminist movement. It can only be less likely than the first thing. Taking those two statements at the same time actually reduces the probability of it being true. So, but this is a classic problem. We're not very good at A, logical thinking with our System 1 brain, and B, we're really bad at conditional probabilities, at being able to take into account how something is in context of something else. But more importantly, is that what happens with the brain when you see the text and you see the statement is the mind, the System 1 latches on to the things that make sense to it. The numbers are almost completely ignored. You know, we see things like Me Too, social justice, discrimination, and then we see the question, is she a feminist? And we go, yes, she is. Because let's face it, she probably is. But that's not the point. I asked you which one was more likely, and it has to be number one. Okay? So that's a challenge for our System 1 thinking. Now, getting into these System 1 thinking, we've uncovered Biases. Bias is a very common thing now in sort of business terminology. Everybody likes to talk about bias. You've probably seen these kind of things before, but I'm going to introduce, if you haven't, two of my favourite biases that I talk about and use in many situations. Anchoring is number one. Anchoring is really simple. It's when you're looking at one particular number, how it affects looking at a number subsequently after it. How seeing one figure now can affect the way that you interpret a subsequent figure. That might not make sense to you immediately, but the point is that system one actually sort of ties two figures together over time, whether you know it or not. Anchoring is actually all around us. This is a personal example from just a few weeks ago for me. We had Father's Day. We're certainly in the UK, I assume we have Father's Day everywhere. Now for all the men in the audience, if you've ever gone sort of searching for razor buying, you'll know that the best time to get a deal is Father's Day or Christmas, right? It's when they've got all the offers on. You know you can buy a cheap razor at that time. But if you've gone shopping then like I did, hence the clean shave, and that's what I do for this kind of presentation, actually go and shave. I was in the minority because the people actually buying razors on Father's Day and Christmas are not the men who know how much shavers cost. The people buying shavers on Father's Day are the wives, are the sons and the daughters thinking what gift they're going to get for their spouse, their pa, and all that kind of thing. And the challenge is, how much are they going to spend, right? They might have in their pocket £50 that they're going to spend on a razor. And they go to Boots and they say, right, show me all your razors. And Boots sort by best match. Now in Boots' definition of best match, it's actually put in £300 razors at the top, okay? Now you may or may not know this, but £300 is a lot of money to spend on a razor. It is the top end. You don't really get many more expensive ones than that. Now it's not the point that little Joey or the wife of the wonderful father is going to spend £300. The point is they started thinking maybe I'm going to spend £50. But they see that and the unconscious mind suddenly says, ooh, that's £300. Okay, maybe I need to be spending closer to £300. Suddenly, when you start to scroll down and getting to the other razors that are around about 80, 100, £150, it becomes a lot more reasonable. You're a lot more likely to say, actually, yeah, £50 was my budget, but you know what? My dad deserves it. He really does. And then they spend more. And that's the thing, because your unconscious system one thinking is just taking these numbers in and not actually really thinking about it. But it's influencing the decisions that you make. I'll ask you now, how many of you bought something, perhaps paid more than you thought you intended to do it, and then walked out of the showroom or whatever it is and had buyer's remorse? You've actually sat there and gone, I didn't mean to spend that. Why did I spend that? And never mind, you've just walked on. And that moment is just your system 2 going, what the heck happened to system 1? System 1's just taken over and you've gone, yeah, it makes sense. No. Then your system 2 then goes to sleep and system 1 goes, yeah, it was a good purchase, you'll be fine. Okay. So, second bias, framing. Now framing is, it's kind of obvious, but it's sort of proven to be the case. That if we present a figure, a statistic, a probability, if we present it in a certain light, we're more likely to act upon it or believe it. If we present it in a positive manner with positive impact, then somebody is more likely to take that on board. Just look at some of these examples on the left-hand side. So products being proven effective in 80% of cases. Maybe the meal contains 75% lean meat, whatever the case may be. If I put exactly the same statistics, the same numbers, the same data on the right-hand side, but put it in a negative frame, just look at those and read them. How do they make you feel? Okay? Just think about it. Because it's how you feel is how you react, right? It's irrelevant, the actual data that's in there. It's that the system 1 thinking loves positive messages. What it really hates is negative message, and it really hates losing things. We really don't like losing things that we think that we have. And that again is your caveman taking control of those kind of situations. So let's move on to calculations. Just getting into sort of nuts and bolts of how we do some maths and what we're perhaps good and bad at. You've probably seen this before, but stick with me. We just talk about basic things like mean, median and mode. You're all analysts in here, I assume, or you work with numbers, so this is not going to be new to you. But just in case, the mean is what we typically call the average. It is the sort of like the sum of sales divided by the number of records that you have. It is like the arithmetic mean as we know it. The median tends to be the mid-value of all your data if it was ranked. If you sort of lined it all up, you pick the thing that was right in the middle, that's your median. Okay? We've all been to school. But where does that get interesting for our System 1 and System 2 thinking? Now, I don't know this for sure, I don't have evidence of this, but I think the way it works is your System 1 thinking tends to assume or know or understand about something called the normal distribution. You might not have really got it when you did statistics at school, but your caveman does understand that most of us are in the middle. And some people will be at the sides, you know, at the low point, and some of us will be at the high point. That's fine. The caveman gets it. System 1 gets it. The reality is that the world often contains skewed data. But actually it takes time and energy, conscious energy, to think about how the data is skewed. And that actually when you start to work with data, you have to start to take into account how the data is perhaps stretched on one side or another. The caveman certainly doesn't really cope with things like long tails and you know, extreme outliers. I mean, just a quick example of the caveman within us. If I did a survey, if I sort of analysed you all in terms of how well you drove, you know, whether you're good at driving a car or not, we'll get something on the left-hand side. We'll get a nice normal distribution. If I go around the room and ask you, how well do you think you drive? Okay, we'll get something like the right-hand side. Because very few people here, and think about it now, will admit to themselves that they are possibly less than average drivers, right? Everybody says, well, I might not be great, but I'm better than average. I'm better than most people on the roads. But that can't be right? Because half of us have to be below average, you know? It's just inescapable. So, just really sort of drilling home this mean, median and mode stuff, which is the median is great to use if you're trying to hide inequalities within data. What it means is it doesn't matter what's on the tails of your data. Whereas the mean is the opposite. It's actually very sensitive to things that are on the ends of your data. So if you're trying to make things better or worse, if you're trying to get a message out there and there is inequality in the data, then you will use the median. Quick example, talking about salaries. Let's talk about salaries. I don't know what the average salary in the room is. Let's just pick a number, 40K, okay? Some of us will earn more, some of us will earn less. The median and the mean will be relatively close in that state. If I measure everybody now, we'll broadly be around that 40K. However, if these two gentlemen walk in the room, this is Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates, two of the richest men in the world. If they walk in the room and we do the same analysis, the mean is suddenly shifted, right? The mean suddenly says that we've all earning like the equivalent of a third world country. We'll know that's not the truth, but that's what the data says, right? Kind of hidden like the real world, but it's exposed this kind of, it's telling a different story. Actually, the median will probably stay relatively the same because adding two people to this big lung of ranked data and still picking the midpoint, you're still going to pick roughly around the midpoint. Doesn't make any difference. So, keeping on salaries, just a quick example of how we work with percentages and how the System 1 works with percentages. What's the average increase of salary over 2 periods where you've got an increase of 100% in one, you're followed by a decrease of 50% in the other? Some of you there going, I didn't come here to do maths. Okay, I won't ask you to put your hands up, but who thinks it's 25%? Okay? Or who thinks it's 0%? Okay, good, majority of you. It's worth noting that it's this kind of thing that actually the average person doesn't deal very well with. And actually I would argue the caveman doesn't deal very well with it because they see the percentage as a number and they know that with numbers you just kind of add and take them away and you kind of average them. When I say average, it just takes the 100 and the 50 and tries to find the midpoint. That's kind of your caveman work. It's not you thinking about how percentages work. In order for percentages to work, you need to have the context of what the percentage is applied to. The real answer is, of course, the 0. That when you take your salary of today of £40,000 and you double it, you add 100,000, you turn it to £80,000. If you take away 50%, then actually you're back to 40,000 again. But like I say, we're all analysts here, you probably all work with numbers, but the average person doesn't really pick up that kind of thing very well. Again, percentages, you've got £10,000 on a credit card. It has 20% APR, i.e. how much you owe every year. So how long before it doubles? Okay? The average person or the average caveman will probably say, well, actually they might not know. But I'll ask you both that and then how long before it quadruples. The average person will say that it takes 5 years to double and that it takes 10 years to actually pay off because they don't take into account the compound nature of interest. They don't actually do the calculation of 20% year on year on year on year. And the figure there actually shows what I think Cavey or Caveman predicts, which is the blue line, versus what they'll end up owing after 10 years. And it only quadruples within about a 7-year period. So their budgeting will be, flawed. So poor old Cavey is left with nothing to, no money basically. So moving on, changing track slightly. When we think about how percentages and figures are actually presented by people, we have to be careful of how they're presenting the argument as well. That they are comparing apples with apples and oranges with oranges. For those of you who don't know, this is Jeremy Hunt. He's a minister. He's again in charge of our health service in the UK. And recently, probably about 3 or 4 months ago, there's a lot of unrest about salaries and how much people are getting paid. But it's okay because Jeremy's there with our favourite channel of media distribution, Twitter, to let us know that actually there's a great pay offer on the table for everybody in the NHS. I'm not going to dig into it too much. I'm not going to point out that actually 6.5 wasn't the lowest amount that people would receive. The point I want to make is that he gave this gap between 6.5 and 29% and said, hey, everybody's going to be better off, right? But the 29% for NHS staff could only be achieved by a certain small set of people, and only if they didn't just get pay raises, they actually changed jobs. They actually improved their status within the organisation, right? They actually achieved promotion over the same period of time. So that means, and that small set of people wasn't doctors and nurses. It was for people like communications managers and estate managers and all that kind of people. So when you're looking at the facts and you're saying, well, people, there's a 29% increase for people in the NHS. Isn't that fantastic? The reality is it's such a small set of people that it isn't necessarily the truth, I don't think. It's also the fact that it's combining both the salary increase and the promotion means that I just think the statement's just completely untrue and misleading. But it's a headline, right? You don't think about it, you just look at it and go, aren't they doing well? Or won't they be doing well? And actually when you put it through the mixer and you actually look at the calculations and inflation and all those kind of things, the average staff for this deal, the average staff member would be no more than a percentage point better off. Okay? Enough to make KV a little bit upset. He can't do the maths, but he probably won't be happy with the outcome. So, data collection. Surveys. We've all done surveys, haven't we? We've probably used them in our everyday life and even built surveys for other people. I took a gamble on this slide, by the way. For those of you who don't know, this is Gareth Southgate, the England manager, and I knew that it might be, it might not be a good thing to talk about this the day after the match yesterday, but it all went well, so we're all happy, at least in England. Anyway. So let's say that Gareth now has a problem. He has a match against Sweden next, okay? And he's played a lot of different people. Some people are injured, some people are worn out. He's got a challenge. He's thinking to himself, who should be in the next team? Who should I play in the next match? Okay, who's my first 11? So have a think about it. He thinks, well, you know what? I'm analytic, I'm data-driven, I'm going to send out a survey and ask, what do people think? Who should be in my next 11, in my next team? And the reason I've given this kind of context is because I think we can all sort of understand his dilemma here. Like, who does he ask, right? Does he ask the people who have already played for him? They'll probably say, pick me, guy. I played last match, I did really well. You should pick me, I'm doing absolutely fantastic. Does he ask the people who he hasn't played? They'll be like, your team selection is rubbish. You know, you really need to play me. I'm the right person. Does he ask the pundits? Does he put a survey out on the BBC asking for the, you know, the voice of the British nation or the English nation? Let's not carry it away. We wouldn't want the Welsh voting in it, would we? But the point is, I hope the point that I'm getting across, is that who he decides to select for that survey is not an obvious thing to do. You know, who's the right audience that he should pick? And I'm not saying there is necessarily a right answer there, but I'm trying to get you into the idea that actually that sort of data selection process, particularly in surveys, is really, really significant. And that questionnaires themselves, depending on how you choose to ask a question, they themselves can introduce bias and problems, and means that the data you collect is not representative of what you should do or what people think. You'll notice a little bias on my part here. So, you could send a question out along with the survey which is asking whether Raheem Sterling is too short to play up front. For those of you who don't know, he's a little short guy, plays for England. It's pretty good. But if you ask the question in that kind of way, you're leading and anchoring the people who are reading the survey. You're actually sort of implying that he's already too short, and you should be thinking about how short he is. He's too short. He shouldn't play, right? It's not good. Has Raheem Sterling missed too many chances to be in the starting 11? Again, it's a leading question. So again, you've got to think about what are you trying to get at with the question that you're asking, and also anticipate how it's going to be interpreted by the audience. Where does Raheem Sterling enjoy drinking beer? It's a loaded question. Maybe he doesn't like drinking beer. But I'm already putting into your mind that he's got a favourite little pub somewhere in Russia, knocking back a few vodkas. Do you believe Raheem Sterling always gives 110%? It's an example of jargon, lacks clarity. It's a poorly phrased question. Okay? How is a person actually supposed to answer that? Now you might say, well, this is questionnaires, this is survey data, I don't deal with that, I deal with like real data. Yeah, I deal with like rock star kind of stuff. But the thing is, you've got to have confidence in the data that you work with. And you've always got to be thinking about the data that you don't have. We touch on ideas about extrapolation, interpolation and overfitting. I mean, how many times, particularly those of you in the UK, have you watched like the Dragon's Den episode where people turn up and say, yeah, we expect to sell 2 billion units in the first year. And then when they dig into it, they find out that actually they've only sold like 100 units. And actually of those 100 units, 50 of those were given away for free. But somehow they've managed to assume that this company is now worth like this astronomical amount based on a really small subset of data that they've collected. So with extrapolation and interpolation, we're kind of exaggerating on a data set. We're trying to say things about data we don't necessarily have. So I decided to take something as uncontroversial as climate change as an example. If you look at climate change, the global air temperature over a particular period of time, say 98 to 2012, you actually see that global air temperatures are dropping, right? Climate change is not an issue. That's the message, right? This data comes from NASA. This example was actually provided in, real websites. It's not working, right? We don't have a problem. We don't have anything to worry about. This is probably the, the dashboard that Trump sees like every day. He doesn't like look at what's happening now. Just looks at this. But obviously, if we look at the problem in a wider context, so say from the 1980s to 2012, we actually see that there has been an increase. That the average temperature, global temperatures, have been going up. So again, this supports the idea of climate change and whatever the case may be. Actually, if you look into the data going back, say, 100 years, you'll notice that this period is actually, it's increasing more rapidly during this period. So actually, if you really wanted to sort of temper your opinion on climate change, you could take a broader view. Because over that bigger period, actually, it's not been increasing as much as it has been in the last few decades. But those are examples of, could be examples of extrapolation, taking a piece of data and then talking about things outside of it that we don't know, i.e. that you've not got measurements for. Why do I care about some of these things? Well, data bias, we talked about surveys, but data bias and selection issues is a huge issue everywhere, okay? And maybe you're sitting there in the crowd going, well, it doesn't matter about me, I'm a data scientist, I don't have to worry about these kind of things. But data bias impacts AI and machine learning as much as human analysis. In fact, almost more so, okay? I got a press example from, I think, a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago. I'll give you a chance to sort of have a look at this. So Press release within the last week, Microsoft said that they have improved or corrected their racist facial recognition system. So, first of all, as seen as we're talking about it, look at the way it's reported. It identifies darker faces 20 times better. I mean, it's nonsense, right? It's not that it does it better, it's that it's reduced the error of the model. So that's a side issue, right? The reporting is terrible. And again, this is kind of misleading in some ways. But how did this problem come about? How did Microsoft actually release a product that had issues such as this, where there was either sexist bias or racial bias within the system? Well, it's because they didn't check the data, right? It's because there were biases within the underlying data. Not necessarily in a nasty way. They just didn't necessarily have either the data that represented female faces or that represented dark faces, or alternatively, they didn't check the error rates for that particular small category, okay? So this is an issue. This whole kind of data selection and bias is something that actually is an issue across the board. And there's nothing to say that when they fixed it, i.e. they've come up with a new system that is better, there's nothing to say that they haven't introduced some other form of bias as well, okay? And the only way you can get around this is to start exploring the data all of the time. It's a really messy area, and it's one that AI cannot automatically save us from. We can only avoid these kind of problems by actually actively getting down and dirty with the data. Okay? So, again, slightly changing track a little, but still keeping on the topic of data collection. It's worth noting that correlations happen all the time. Okay, and the more data you collect, the more correlations you'll find. It's very easy to say that actually there is a correlation between eating ice cream and shark attacks. It's probably not the case that sharks are particularly favoured of raspberry ripple oozing out of your skin pores as you swim in the ocean. It's simply that they are correlated because things happen in warm weather, right? The sun's out, everybody's eating ice cream, they're all going in the sea and they're all getting eaten by sharks. Okay, not all of them, but some of them are. The fact is they are correlated. Now, this is usually the time when, like, the presenter like me says, oh, correlation doesn't equal causation. And everybody in the audience goes, I've heard that before. Okay, and I hate it. I hate that as a statement. But it's the one that so many people seem to make because it makes them sound clever about statistics. Correlation does not equal causation. But let me ask you the question, what does? What does equal causation? How do you prove that something is actually connected to another? Actually, a lot of the time, correlation is all that we've got to go on. The trick is not that correlation doesn't equal causation, it's that correlations are all around us, and that we have to be able to understand that we need to be able to dismiss the ones that obviously don't make sense, or at least investigate them further. We don't accept that they cause something, but it's not that, it doesn't get to the root of causation, which is a much bigger thing, which I'm not going to spend time talking about too much today. You should always be asking, does the correlation make sense? Can I prove the connection? And should I be using this in my further study or when discussing this with other people? So where do we go from here? I've talked about problems and lies and statistics, but let's just talk about how we go about the process of using the statistics in our everyday life. Now, in the media, if you see a statistic, and actually even within most of our data-driven organizations, the majority of the time there's a narrative, okay? People have something they are trying to say, and then they will go and find the data that supports that, okay? So I want to say something, I want to prove that everything's rosy like Tim Cook, it's all going very well. I will collect the data that helps me tell that story. In the stats world of data science, along come the data scientists, the big data people, in fact, all of us software vendors over the last sort of 30, 40 years, we've been saying, assemble your data and you will find truth, okay? It's that you don't have the data at the moment that, but once you have it, you will have truth in your organization, it will be of great value to you. You'll be successful, you'll be fantastic, the world will be your oyster. But we touched on this earlier. If you're just blindly gathering data, if you're not really thinking about data collection in the context of where that data fits into your organization, how it affects the humans who it will affect, it's it's bad, right? The AI and the machine learning that people build, it will be weak, it will be brittle, and unfortunately it will be too opaque for us to really understand what's happening. So having this approach of just taking data and hoping that there will be magical algorithms that fix things, it's really a bad way to go. Because my main worry in this kind, if I'm getting serious, my main worry is not that, AI is going to steal all our jobs, going to look at all our data and we're all going to be, well, I don't know, maybe drinking more beer perhaps, but it's not that it will steal the jobs, it's that it will steal the jobs and actually leave us less effective in the roles that we have. Because things can change. Assumptions, human activities can change in ways that the AI or the machine learning may not be able to predict or work with. And if the AI contains the knowledge of how to deal with certain situations and we are unable to understand what we should be doing at points of crisis or emergency or change, then we're actually less effective and less agile than we are today. Okay? And what I'm hoping for is a world of AI and machine learning where we've actually got a real sort of combination between the smarts, the computational smarts of algorithms, but actually the context of human life and human data. So where does statistics really add value? Well, this is sort of broadly just a quick look at the idea of scientific method. So, and yes, even science falls foul of bias and poorly selected data and publication bias and confirmation bias, i.e. we're all looking for things that we want to find. They've even got these sort of nasty little things called p-hacking. Some of the little scientists in the room will go, oh yeah, I know what you mean. i.e. they're just basically fudging the numbers to make things happen. But one of the key things in the scientific method is not necessarily using some clever bit of statistics. It's actually the process of going through proposing hypotheses and beliefs and then actually looking at the impact that they have. The real value for me is this kind of, once you've got an idea and you have assembled your data, that you then test the hell out of it, or that you give it for other people to look at. There are references that people can follow up, that you can get them to be critical about your thinking and your ideas because you might not be right. Okay? So one of the major, most important things for me in the whole use of statistics and scientific method is that. And that's where I think Tableau really fits in. Okay? Tableau really starts to add value because it isn't just about a visualization or a dashboard. It isn't just about a narrative. It's actually about getting as many eyeballs on the problem as you can. It's kind of echoing something that James said earlier, and he didn't give me I didn't know he was going to say that, so we're not that well organized. But you've got to allow people, you've got to democratize the data such that the more people are looking at the problem, the more likely you are to spot errors, issues, problems. It's the same with your data sources, right? It isn't just about using you've got to find the right data sources to use. You've got to uncover the errors, but without using a magic algorithm. It's usually very much still about using the eyeballs to see where there's been problems, where you've spotted issues, and then being able to update that. I quite like this view. This is Tableau Server. It's great because it shows you where the majority of people are getting their data from, which data sources are most commonly used. And again, it's using that wisdom of the crowds to try and get to the right data that you should be using. And if that doesn't work, then we do have things like the automatic recommendations. It's based on community usage. This is essentially just automating the eyeballs. It's saying everybody is using this particular data, or given what you're looking at, this is the data set we believe you should be using. And what else is there? Hey, there's more information about that data, where it's being used, who put it up there. In fact, if I go like this, you have the ability to certify the data sources. Now, why is that important? Well, it's not just important to say, this is the right data, because it might not be. It might still have errors in it. But the cool thing is there's a guy there I can chase. If I find a problem, I can go back to them and say, I found a problem, can you fix it? Or, I think there's a problem, can you tell me more about how you assembled this data? So you're building this chain of referenceability across the whole process. And then what else are you doing? You're giving people the ability to actually connect to their data. So you're not just saying, here is a set of data, like it or leave it. What you're doing is, within Tableau, you're giving the ability to say, well, connect to the data. Do your own explorations. Find out, see whether it chimes true with what you see about the world. Should that number be going up or down? does it really work that way? And as well as that, if you're looking at even if you're just looking at other people's dashboards, maybe you're just a viewer, you have the ability to add comments and context around other people's findings. And again, what we're really saying is it's about giving the users the opportunity to question and challenge the information that's in front of them. So you accept that the caveman is there, but you're giving people the tools to embrace their Einstein. Not everybody will, but you've got to give them that capability. So let's go back to that story at the top of the session. Lighten the mood again. Hey, chocolate, losing weight. Isn't it great? We eat more chocolate, we lose weight. Well, this was actually done by a journalist in Germany. And he did it in conjunction with a GP, so he had like the authority of a doctor. You know, he had the qualifications. They basically selected a bunch of people, a very small selection of people, off Facebook, paid them some money, then looked for correlations in the data set, right? And they were looking for anything. They were looking to see whether chocolate could be correlated with high blood pressure. They were looking for whether, you know, chocolate had a problem with, memory retention or something like that. And they just happened to, you know, hit the mother lode. They hit that correlation that said you eat chocolate and suddenly you actually lose weight. So what happens? They then publish this to a journal. Now, this isn't necessarily a reputable journal, but it's not a non-reputable journal. They essentially are hunting, or they're keen for scientific stories, right? And they put it out there, maybe even paid some money to these organisations to make sure that this story was being picked up. And then suddenly the network, the journalists say, hey, there is a recognised story within a recognised publication. Isn't that great? And there you've got your fake news, right? Because nobody's actually checking at any point. Nobody's exposing the underlying truth in the matter. So it's actually very easy to get your fake news out there. So, are we part of the problem? I'm kind of hopefully trying to translate that we are the problem, right? And it's up to you to take the responsibility with the figures that you use and the figures that you communicate to other people. You've got to acknowledge the cavemen within, right? They are there. You cannot remove them, but you can go beyond them. You can engage with the figures that you use and the ones that you share. You can ask other people to engage more with you. If you can, add context to your numbers, make those calculations easier, but also make the reference of where those figures come from easier for other people to find. You've really got to democratize the process for fact-checking. You've got to let them help you find your truth. So in summary, what I hope we've seen is that if we want to use statistics to lie, these are the kind of things that you need to do. Okay? You need to show things that are too good to be true. People want to believe. You need to play on people's fears. You need to use bad visuals, confuse them with percentages, etc., etc. Use small samples. Don't look at the data that you're collecting. But most importantly of all, you dress up in a doctor's coat. So the key takeaway, hopefully you've understood how statistics can have an effect in our decision making. Hopefully I've encouraged you to engage with the numbers all around us. Remember that the caveman is there, but you've got to engage your Einstein. But to finish, I'd just like to point out you could always use this knowledge to your own advantage. So I'd like to point out that hundreds of thousands of people love Tableau. They come to their conferences and it's a great time. But with that in mind, I'd like you to fill out a survey. So please go to your session details, and I think just if you scroll down in the details section, please feel free to comment and fill out this survey for me. Thank you for your time today, and have a great conference.